Hello everyone and welcome to Module 2 for Gorgias. Just a very quick recap of what we've looked at so far. So one of the key ideas of the first part of the text is Callicles' idea of the natural right.
Yeah.
Which he claims and which Socrates sums up as being the right of the strong to dominate the weak, and for the superior to take the property, to seizure of property of the less superior, and what's another thing they say? Dominate, just generally mistreat the weak, I guess. So that's the natural right, apparently, that we have, and that's based on people being superior. And he says that superior is stronger and better. And so then Socrates challenges him on that and challenges him on that definition. Particularly, so he starts off by challenging stronger and says that aren't the masses stronger, and Callicles has to concede, and then he changes it to cleverer. And then Socrates uses that reductio ad absurdum argument, and which is quite really silly. And
you don't like that one?
Yes, no, I think it's stupid. And he retreats from cleverer, and he settles on people who use their cleverness or their strengths to lead a political life. Okay?
That was an intense recap, Tim. Well done.
Yeah, so it's just chucked it all out, yeah.
I liked it.
Cool.
So let's begin the next section of the text. I believe we are at 491E. After the next italicized bit. Here, it's really hard to see how this links to the previous section. It seems to be quite a tenuous link to me.
Yep.
As you've just described, the previous section they talked about natural right. And so Socrates kind of segues by saying, but what are they to themselves? And they, I think he means the superior. Okay. So they've talked about what the superior should do to others. And now he says, what should they do to themselves? Should they rule themselves or be subjects? And Callicles has no idea what he's talking about, so he explains himself. He's like, in other words, should they rule themselves, i.e. be self-disciplined, or should they just be, like, not self-controlled?
Yeah.
And Callicles here kind of presents, or really restates his argument for hedonism. He's already kind of stated that, hasn't he? Hasn't he? Oh, no, he hasn't. No, he hasn't. Okay. So here he's giving his argument for hedonism. He says the only authentic way of life is to do nothing to hinder the expansion of one's desires. So you should let your desires expand as fully as possible. So you're wanting heaps of stuff and you're just satisfying yourself with all that stuff.
So is that his argument for it? Is that really what it is?
It's that's his contention, that they should. Yeah.
So this is how you should live your life.
He gives this example.
Hedonistic life.
That's right. He gives an example in page 79. Imagine someone born to inherit a kingdom. Blah blah blah. In all honesty, could anything be more shameful than self-discipline for that kind of person? So he thinks if you're like a strong, powerful person who has this capacity to live a very pleasurable life, it would be terrible to waste that. You should just go after it and get as much pleasure as you can.
Yeah.
So Socrates questions him and says, so the idea that people who need nothing are happy is wrong. So that's a very Buddhist idea, the idea that people who need nothing are happy. So it's good if you don't have desire. That's Buddhist.
Okay.
But Callicles thinks that's wrong. And this is kind of the reason, like one of his premises probably for the hedonistic argument. He says, yeah, if you need nothing, then you would be no happier than a stone or a corpse. Like, you wouldn't be living life at all. You'd practically be dead. To have no desires is to practically be dead. Therefore, it's bad.
All right.
Hedonism, all the way. So, in this module, we are going to go through two counter-arguments that Socrates gives against the argument for hedonism.
Mm-hmm.
Altogether, there's 4 counter-arguments that you need to know. The remaining 2 we are going to do in Module 3.
Okay.
In this module, we're going to go through the leaky jar argument, which is quite a famous argument that Socrates gives against hedonism, and also the life of itching and scratching, which is very similar to the leaky jar argument. Right. So first, leaky jar. All right. So on page 80, halfway down, Socrates starts kind of telling some stories. I once heard a wise man claim that the part of the mind which contains the desires, is characterized by its instability, so being unstable. And he heard another story where this part of the mind which contains your desires was called a jar, right?
Yeah.
So in fools, in people, I guess Socrates is saying in people who are not self-controlled and silly people,
Yeah.
that part of the mind is leaky, right? So this kind of links to the next slide. So we've got this mind that is like a leaky jar, the part of the mind that contains the desires. And Socrates then gives this analogy of a self-controlled person, a person who's able to control what they want, and a self-indulgent person who just goes after hedonism, you know? Imagine that both of these people have a number of jars, like literal jars, right?
No.
And he goes on this whole thing about, imagine that the jars, this is on page 81, the jars are filled with wine, honey, milk, and all this other good stuff, right?
Yeah.
So they've worked hard to get all these good things, and now they want to keep them. So he's saying that the self-controlled person, once he's got the jars full, he then gives them no further thought because they're not leaky.
Yeah.
But with the self-indulgent person, they're leaky and they're constantly dripping out, and therefore he has to work really hard to fill them up. Can you see how this relates to the pleasure thing? The life of pleasure?
Sure.
All right, allow me to explain.
Yes, please.
Okay, if you are always seeking pleasure, what do you want? What do you want? You want...
Pleasure.
You want...
To be fulfilled.
Food, you want cake,
yeah.
you want other things, presumably.
Fun.
Fun times.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, guys. So, to get back on track, the self-controlled man, his jars are not leaky. The self-indulgent man, his jars are leaky. This relates to pleasure because if you are always seeking pleasure,
Yeah.
Okay, say I really want that chocolate cake.
Yeah.
I really want to eat it. When I eat it, it gives me pleasure. Woohoo.
Yeah.
However, that pleasure is going to go away in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
It's not a constant state of pleasure that I can always keep up. So this is the analogy of the pleasure leaking away through the jar. And then I'm going to want to work even harder.
I think that is so weird.
No, it's good. Then I'm going to work even harder to get my next hit. It's exactly like having an addiction. Why having an addiction is so bad.
But you don't have like this finite pool of pleasure.
What?
Like...
No, but he's saying in a leaky jar. No, it's not a finite pool of milk and honey.
Yeah.
He gets more milk and honey, but he's always having to put it in the jar because it's constantly leaking out.
That makes more sense. Okay.
Yeah. Whereas a person who is just satisfied with what they have is able to be calm and not in this constant state of desire where they're trying to fill themselves up all the time.
Will they ever have some milk and honey?
Yeah, they've got it. That's what he's saying. They've got it in the jar. It's safe. They don't have to give it any further thought. This is like, it always makes me think of Buddhism with the middle way in Buddhism. So, yeah, you know about this, they strive not for the highs and lows, but for the middle.
Okay.
Just that sense of satisfaction. And the aim of Buddhism is to get rid of desire.
Yeah.
Because they say desire is like the source of all pain and suffering for humans. So I think that is what Socrates is advocating.
Can I quickly ask another quick question?
Yeah.
Why is when the self-indulgent person, the person who's eating the chocolate cake, why is when they're using some of the milk and honey, it's leaking away, whereas...
But unfortunately, Callicles is not immediately convinced by this argument.
No.
He says, even if your analogy is correct with the jars, the self-controlled man with the full jars can no longer feel pleasure, and therefore his life is nothing more than a stone or a corpse.
Okay.
And to have a good life, we need to keep pouring in as much pleasure as possible. But then Socrates kind of reiterates his argument and says, yeah, but if there's a lot of stuff pouring in, there must be a lot of stuff leaving. So it's kind of like this life of highs and lows, like in the Buddhist thing. Highs and lows rather than the middle ground.
Okay.
And Socrates also references a gully bird. I don't know what this is, but I assume it's like a bird that just goes and gets things all the time and then kind of loses them.
Okay.
So he's saying instead of the life of a stone or a corpse, you're just living a life of a gully bird going back and forth between highs and lows. I assume that's what the gully bird metaphor is. So the entire point of these arguments is for Socrates, the point is to establish that a life of hedonism is not a good life.
Yeah.
Because it's not actually that pleasant. In fact, the word he uses is terrifying. It's terrifying to live a life where you're constantly having to search for your next hit of pleasure.
Yeah, so it's terrifying to be a gully bird, like the last analogy.
Yeah, that's right. But Callicles is still maintaining that it's better than living
being this boring
self-controlled life. And then, so that was the first counter-argument, the leaky jar. This is the second one, very quick. It's just another analogy that Socrates makes. He says a life where you're constantly seeking pleasure is like a life of itching and scratching. So you get an itch. My itch is for that chocolate cake. Yeah. And then I scratch it by eating the chocolate cake. So the itch is like the desire, and the scratching is the satisfying that desire, you know? And he says, well, is that a pleasant life? Yeah. He's obviously implying that it's not a pleasant life. And Callicles thinks a life of scratching is a pleasant life because that's the satisfaction. Like the scratching feels good, the itching doesn't feel good, right?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and here we go. Okay. Yeah, this is the part where Socrates then says, okay. Oh, this topic is a bit controversial, isn't it? So you get an itch and you scratch it. Yeah. Socrates is saying, okay, so is that itching and scratching only restricted to his head, or does it extend to other parts of the body? Presumably. Because actually, like...
So now they're talking very literally about actual itching and scratching.
Well, he's saying, okay, you can have desires for certain things. You can have a desire to scratch an itch. You can have a desire to eat a cake. You can also have a desire to just engage in, like, frivolous sexual things, right? Is that kind of what you're getting from this?
Okay. Which is the male prostitute
so
here.
That's having a certain itch and scratching it.
So the male prostitute has the itch of sleeping with people, and so sleeps with people, and the sleeping with people is scratching the itch.
Yeah, the itch is the desire to do that.
All right.
Yeah. So Socrates is saying, and he actually doesn't, like, see whether it says restricted to his head or ... That's actually from the text. Like, he's just kind of implying where this is going. Okay. And he goes, do you want me to continue this line of questioning, or do you get where I'm going here? You know?
So is he talking about actually itching other physical parts?
Yeah, I don't think he's talking about literally itching.
Oh. Well,
but he's talking about other metaphorical itches that you might want to scratch.
Yeah.
Yeah? And then he says, so really what we're saying, what you are saying, Callicles, is that the life of a male prostitute is the best kind of life, because he's just constantly scratching his itches.
Yeah.
And then Callicles gets all disgusted and is like, oh, you horrible man, why are you taking this down this unsavoury path? Yeah. And Socrates is like, well, actually, you're the one taking it down this path, because... Yeah. According to you, we should live hedonistically, which means that being a male prostitute is the best kind of life. So this is kind of, Socrates is saying this is an implication of the argument, which is unacceptable. Yeah. We don't think that's the best kind of life. Yeah. And therefore the life of itching and scratching can't be the best type of life.
All right.
Well, that's the end of that extremely awkward podcast.